Hello, good morning. My name is Pablo Mateos, and I would like to thank Frederic for my invitation to participate in this conference. I'm a geographer and I work in issues of population geography and concentration of ethnicity in general. And the title of the talk today is going to be segregation in Britain and a short example of some work I've done on European cities. My main research is on using names and the origin of names to overcome the lack of ethnicity statistics in several countries. Frederic also asked me to do a short introduction on the history of migration in Britain and segregation in Britain. And Kerry Peach, who was planning to attend this conference, unfortunately couldn't join. So I've been in contact with him and I would like to thank him for some ideas. So the first part, we'll go on to the contents. So basically my presentation will be split in two parts. In the first one I will talk about segregation in Britain to give a little bit of context. And I will touch upon some of the maps that were shown before. A brief history of migration groups and recent migration in Britain. And I'll talk briefly about patterns of segregation in European cities, in British cities. And then I'll introduce you very briefly to the methodology I developed using names and ethnicity, and two examples of its applications, looking at segregation in London in particular, and some European cities. So first of all, the context of where segregation debates is placed in Britain at the moment is within a broader debate on issues about migration policy, ethnic relations, the relation between religions and the state, primarily Islam, and issues of national identity, which are probably common to the rest of Europe and somehow to the US at the moment. Since 2005, mainly since the London bombings and following from the 2001 September 11, there's been a stark shift of policies, from policies that promoted multicultural aspects of diversity and celebrated diversity and increased resources to promote diversity within communities, to policies that are termed as assimilationist, that look at increasing social integration and integration in general. So the latest buzzword in politics is community cohesion, and there are several reports that try to tackle issues of spatial separation because they are seen as a problem to social integration. So we've seen in the media how the media represents these issues. So in these debates on the right here we have the typical headlines on celebrating diversity, multicultural years of the late 1990s and early 2000s, whereas now we see lots of headlines, especially in the tabloid press, like the ones at the bottom. Quick stories that stick in people's minds is like one of the London bombers who broadcasted a video before he took a suicide bomb in London. He had Yorkshire accent, so he was actually born in Britain and had a normal life until a few years ago. And that struck a lot of people as these concentrated communities were somehow harboring extreme religious groups. So the shift has been also towards religion. These are some of the other headlines in the news. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, is obsessed with the idea of promoting Britishness, and they're trying to define what being British is. A lot of people feel uncomfortable about, for example, many Asians don't feeling British. There are studies about segregation in schools, especially there are some publicly funded religious schools that have been criticized. So this gives you an idea about the context. An important speech was made in 2005 by the chairman of the Commission of Racial Equality, Trevor Phillips, who warned about the ghettoization of Britain. This had a lot of implications, and he started to compare the level of segregation in Britain to some of the US cities. But he also added that there are also concerns about why working class ghettos So by this, he was starting to show that people mean by segregation varies a lot, and it's not just issues of ethnicity or race, but also about education and social class. I will briefly summarize a little bit of the history of the main groups, migration and then ethnic minorities in Britain. Basically, we divide the history of recent migration in Britain into two parts. One is from the post-war period until the 1990s, and it was the main groups were coming from what is called the New Commonwealth, the old British colonies, and the Caribbean group was the earliest, and it started to come in the 1950s and early 60s, mainly to London and Birmingham, and focusing on jobs in the public sector, and then followed by immigration from India and Pakistan, going to cities in the north and manufacturing areas, and also the West Midlands and the East Midlands. The cities of Birmingham, Leicester, Bradford, and Leeds are the main destinations of these groups. And then the most recent group is Bangladeshi out of these groups, which is related to the independence of Bangladesh in the 1970s, and it's highly concentrated in London, as we will see. It's just a quick summary of the destination of groups. As I said, that migrants were replacement populations settling in areas where there was labor shortage and economic sectors that failed to attract native workers in the areas I've mentioned. Migrants typically avoided economically marginal areas such as Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and some parts of England. And there was moderate settlement in other areas that were also attractive to native, for example, in the outer parts of London, the suburbs, and the east and southwest. And then more recently, the government has instilled refugee dispersal policies. So they try to house refugees into areas where there were housing vacancies, but usually there were no jobs there. So there's been a secondary movement of refugees from cities in the north back to London. Since 1991, at the end of the Cold War, and also the British census is started to collect data on ethnicity, which spurred a lot of research on looking at ethnicity and issues of second generation and identity in general. There's been a rise in Black African immigration, mainly from Nigeria, Ghana, Somalia, and other countries in East Africa. The asylum seeking system was expanded in the 1990s, and there were many groups that benefit from this. And then since 2004, when the new countries joined the EU, especially from Eastern Europe, there's been a large increase in migrants from these countries. But the new patterns of this migration flow is that they have mostly gone to agricultural areas that never experienced migration before, as well as the large cities. There's also a growing number of what we call the small minorities, especially most of them in London, and here are some examples of groups that are not particularly big related to the size of the origin countries or communities, but which has several thousands or tens of thousands of members in London. And all of the established minorities, which were the ones I mentioned before from the Commonwealth, remain strongly anchored in big cities. And there's currently a process of moving out to the suburbs as second generations progress through the mobility ladder, social mobility ladder. Very recently, Steve Berkovic is talking about super diversity in Britain, and I'll briefly explain that concept in a few minutes. This is the UK 2001 census classification, and so as I mentioned, the census has collected data on ethnicity since 1991, and this is the 2001 classification. In 1991, there were 8 groups, which more or less coincide with these big groups. And in 2001, they added the mixed category, which makes the comparison through time very difficult. Because depending on where you allocate these mixed categories, you could see immigration and hence segregation increasing or decreasing depending on